Speaker, we think that perhaps life is as Hobbes detailed, nasty, brutish, and short. Perhaps it isn't, but the most important thing in this debate is that you cannot know what another person is experiencing is a perception of brutality and suffering, and therefore you ought not enable the circumstances by which they are enabled to suffer. Parenting has a unique capacity to cause suffering, and therefore you ought not bring new children into the world. I think the comparative is fairly simple here. This is not a debate about the narrative of effects of expression of the harm of having children. This is only a debate about the morality. On our side, we say it is immoral. On side opposition, they say it is either morally neutral or positive. We can beat them in either world. 3 points of substantive I'm going to bring to you today. First, what makes something a moral obligation? Second, as to how children cannot consent into being born. And third, as to how you are consigning children to a life of misery. First, what makes something a moral obligation? I think that utilitarianism is the best principle in this scenario. The way that we come to ontological principles, like you should not lie, is typically by utilitarian framing. That is, it is better to live in a world where everyone does not lie, or at least tries not to. So similarly, it is better on balance not to have children. Therefore, we believe that the utilitarian principle is the correct metric by which to evaluate the moral framing in this debate. But I also think that opposition has a uniquely difficult barrier to overcome here, which is the fact that this says biological children, right? The emotional attachment that a parent might feel to its biological child pales in comparison to adoption and the value that comes with taking a child that would not otherwise have parents and giving them parents, right? The unique burden of opposition is to prove that not only is having children itself a moral good, that it exists preferentially to taking care of the millions of children in this world without homes. We say that we feel responsibility with regards to humanity writ large towards one another because we recognize mutual and reciprocal capacity to suffering, right? There is an arbitrary value to your happiness with being like a parent, and we think that like your value as that arbitrary value of happiness that you experience over someone else's happiness is something you cannot know. Given that a parent can lead a reasonably happy life without having children, i.e. if I have children, I might be 10% happier, but I can still create a good life for myself without having children, and we have a large degree of control over our own happiness, we say that you have the moral obligation, therefore, not to have children, to just shape your own happiness, and to not potentially cause a situation in which someone else is created unhappily. Recognize the trade-off here, right? If you can do something with a relatively small cost to yourself, but a large benefit to others, then we think that you ought to do it. And we think that you have a moral obligation to do it, right? Because you have the ability to still live like a good, rewarding, productive life without having children. And there are multiple paths to happiness. We don't think that the path of having children brings enough exclusive benefit to warrant having children. I'm going to take a POI from OO first.
Okay, this debate has to apply to approximately 3.5 billion parents. Are you seriously claiming that there are 3.5 billion unadopted children?
No, I'm not claiming that there are 3.5 billion unadopted children, but I do think that all of the parents out there in the world would be better off if they had adopted a child and would be doing a morally preferable action as to having biological children. I think that this exists on either side of the house. All right. Second point then, children cannot consent into being born, right? Biologically, parents make a decision to conceive a child, and the unborn child has no way to object. That child has not consented to all of the misery and harms to this world. I think that this is important for 3 reasons, right? First, they have no ability to weigh out the good and bad aspects of being born, and they have no ability to opt out of being born. Second of all, we say that children have no alternative once they have been born. Consent requires you to have meaningful choices available, and children don't have that, which means, third and finally, that a parent is asserting their agency over the life of another human being. We say that this is an act of structural violence in the literal definition of violence because you are dictating the terms by which another individual is able to access and opt in to like a lifetime of suffering or a lifetime of pleasure. Even in the best case scenario in which a child does find their life like rewarding, if they look back on their deathbed and say this has been a net positive experience, we would still say that the decision to have a child is a bad one because they weren't really able to fully evaluate the alternatives, right? They aren't able to say that like, oh, if I had not been born, this is the proper counterfactual world which would have existed. People are not in the position to do that. Therefore, it's an act of abrogated consent. Final point then, that you are consigning children to a lifetime of misery, and even if their own existence isn't miserable, you are immiserating others. First, on your own quality of life. You cannot with 100% certainty know that your child will not suffer from depression, that they will be economically prosperous, that they will lead a good life. Structurally, in fact, we would say that if your child is, for example, a female or a person of color, they are likely to face discrimination and racism. Maybe their happy memories outweigh these like unhappy times, but we cannot know this. There is an infinite potential for suffering and a very limited ceiling as to how happy your child can be, especially when you consider the fact that there are known structural constraints to how successful an individual can be based on their lottery of birth. Therefore, you ought not lend credence to the possibility of suffering because it is well known that your child could have a like massively harmful life, and there is in fact a relatively certain ceiling based on where you are in your position in the world as to what type of good life your child is able to lead. I'll take a POI from CO.
Yeah, so would you foreclose any decision which has significant downside risk irrespective of the upside return?
Yeah, I'm sorry. You just said a bunch of financial terms that I don't quite understand. So like, feel free to explain that in your speech, but sure, whatever. All right, going on then. Even if your child themselves lives a good life, again, we cannot know this, your child is negatively contributing to the lives of others, right? Recognize first that life is necessarily competitive as evidenced by the finite amount of resources and limited number of spots we have for competitive roles like things that are entrance into Harvard or an NSF grant, right? Only a few will rise to become the cream of the crop. If your child does do well successfully, if they are happy, that means that happiness is eclipsing someone else's possibility of achievement. We think that that's really harmful because even in the best case scenario for op, where your child lives a rewarding, fruitful life, that means that that comes at the cost of someone else living a rewarding, fruitful life. There are 7 billion other people on the planet that you have an equal moral obligation to. The second thing we would say here is that there is no way to live a carbon neutral existence as of yet. Given that climate change is the biggest harm on our planet and your child will actively be contributing to climate change, actively be worsening things like desertification for people who live in areas that are becoming increasingly arid, make it increasingly difficult for people to access food, we think that you ought not have a child and put them in a position where they are enacting harm simply by the act of existing against people that are already the most disadvantaged. We rest by the principle that it is much worse to do harm to someone than to do good to them, because they can do good for themselves to a much greater extent. Our unique ability as humans is to do harm to others. That is exclusive to this debate. We say that you have a unique ability to do harm to others by having children and a unique ability to do harm to your children. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Okay, I thank that speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the leader of opposition. Here.
Can you hear me? Starting in 3, 2, 1. I love these motions. You can say a lot of crazy things and it all makes sense. First, I don't think consent is a metric. We trade off consent all the time. We have agents in democracies that make decisions on behalf of us. We tend to be okay with it, assuming that the outcomes are things that we derive. Secondly, I think the frame for this debate is one where the status quo operates, which means we can try to discourage the worst kinds of parental harms. We discourage any and all decisions that have irreversible impacts on a child, like, indoctrinating religion, stopping abuse, making sure they don't fully control the career path the child takes. Second, states all the time encourage parental planning, which is why the Chinese government had a one-child policy, which is why Sweden incentivizes more birth because they need more populations. So you can plan based on context, based on what you need. It's unlikely that the world is as bad as they claim it is. I'll do 2 things. Number 1, this is really fun. I will argue enslaving your child is justified. And I'll say that this is the only outcome that you can take because it's a form of self-defense. The second thing I'll say is, it's not really enslavement. Most children will be really happy that you took this choice. Number 1, why do we think this is a form of self-defense? Recognize morality has to take into account current context, which means right or wrong depends on the situation that you find yourself in. There are 2 situations in which we think giving birth is an absolute moral necessity or a legitimate moral choice. Number 1, aging populations, which is to say countries like Japan often don't have a lot of individuals to continue their country in the future. Yes, God might say we might have immigration, and that is a legitimate way of solving it. Yes, that's a legitimate thing, but it's not a moral obligation to form one choice over all others, assuming that choice has problems. What are the problems with immigration? Number one, there's often a limited ability to fit in culturally. Number two, your skill set often doesn't fit into this economy. Number three, you often concentrate into some nations that give you opportunities and have brain drain in others that leave where people leave. So free immigration doesn't count in most cases, and therefore you deserve to choose whether you want immigration or you want the ability to choose. Why and how do we frame this? At a point of survival, because Asian populations are literally at the point of dying in terms of economy, where people don't have food. You can't tell a person, like, kill the dude with a knife or just slap him in the face. It's a point of survival, and therefore they deserve all choices possible, and all of them are morally acceptable. You can't say any of these choices are morally obligatory for you to stop. It's not a moral negative for you to take one choice. Number two, social justice. I think the root cause of a lot of problems that exist on identities that are currently oppressed right now is due to a lack of numbers, i.e., majorities are majorities because they have more numbers. How this works is you often have an intergenerational struggle for you to protect your identity, which means when your identity is currently under attack, you can only see that manifest into more rights in the future. So number one, it is a legitimate choice for you to take a child to see your identity suffer because it's an extension of you, not someone else. This is not a different individual, but an extension of you. If you don't believe the philosophy behind it, literally you gave it creation, it's your intellectual property. Number two, oftentimes numbers are the only way to fix this problem, which is to say, if everyone stops having children right now, the world gets stagnant, majorities always stay majorities. So I don't give a shit if the world survives longer. I have no moral obligation to have a world where the majority is entrenching their privilege and we expand the world for 10 years for them to enjoy. It is my duty to make sure that I get the opportunities even if I kill the world and reduce the number of years it survives. Which means I just don't owe it to anyone. This is a legitimate choice, even in the worst case where we instrumentalize these children because it's the only way to have outcomes. Second, we're not really instrumentalizing these children. And I'll give lots of analysis for this. Before that, CG.
So why do you think that it is good to continue the existence of humanity if humanity has done many bad things like invent nuclear weapons, wage war, destroy species, destroy the planet?
Okay, so that is an argument for mass genocide, not an argument for having children right now. It is unclear why that is the burden that humans themselves have a moral obligation to take. You're arguing a moral obligation for all humans to kill themselves because, they're evil. I don't get it. Makes no sense. Secondly, why do we think life is still something that deserves a moral value? First, they miss the comparative. The comparative is non-existence. Non-existence has no moral value. This is because morality and your conception of everything that is moral is based on existence in the first place. The premise of you saying that utility matters is based on the presumption that in a world where you exist, utility matters. The frame for you to say that deontology matters is based on the presumption that deontology or harmless rape or all the other fancy thought experiments that Ashish introduced matter in a world where these people exist. There is no way for you to measure the moral metrics of non-existence. If you can't measure what the moral value of non-existence is, anything that exists has more moral value. So giving birth, even if it is negative utility, is still morally greater. I'm unclear why happiness is the metric because there is no other metric to compare to non-existence, guys. You can't say, some people are unhappy, but the comparative is no metric whatsoever. That's the comparative. Number two, vast majority of people actually enjoy their life. Two thought experiments, structural reasons under this. Number one, the majority of the world doesn't want to kill themselves. That's one. Number two, we generally see more people being sad at young people dying than old people dying. The structural reasons why most people see their life as a net positive utility is as follows. First, intelligence. Most people really don't ask themselves life questions of higher order, self-actualization. Have I achieved what I wanted to achieve? What is my X capability? Most people are just really happy that even in COVID, when the world is burning, we're debating in a debate tournament. There are small ways in which we create pockets of experience by which we internalize the life. Number two, your expectations of your life are often based on context, which is to say, if you start off poor, you're on a relative scale, really happy that you land a job. You're really happy that you get into a university like Harvard. You're really happy that you, let's forget about Harvard. Any mid-tier university was likely to make you happy. So the comparative, ladies and gentlemen, is one where you always compare to context and derive meaning out of it. Number three, negative experiences are often useful because the sheer amount of pain they cause you often shapes your identity. And this identity is something that you form and therefore use for all other experiences of your life. Because your memories eventually construct your identity, literally every experience that comes subsequent to that negative experience is shaped by the identity that you create. All of which is, unless there's some real net reason for why everyone will always be depressed, it is unclear why most people can have derivation of positive experiences on a relative scale and use that to over-trump that and say that I've overcome my negative experience. I'm a rape victim, but I overcame it. I'm strong. And the world we live in is increasingly becoming liberal. So the cancel cultures that we see and the way in which we promote our values is one that is all-encompassing. So it's unclear why life is of net negative utility. Very glad to win.
We didn't make the finals. These are the things that,
Okay, just a reminder for all observers, please mute yourselves. Okay, great. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. All right, so for POIs, if you wouldn't mind just saying POI, because I'm not looking at the chat right now, I'd appreciate that, and then I will take you. 2 questions in this round. What makes something a moral obligation? And second, what is your ability to improve the world in this scenario? I think it is very telling, by the way, that so much of the LO offense is rested on this idea that you'll improve things in the world through ideas like social justice and immigration and economic growth. In other words, a concession about the importance of utilitarianism. First, on what makes something a moral obligation. We told you that 2 things make something a moral obligation. A first is a connection with the harm being incurred, and the second is an ability to act. I think it is pretty trivially true that your ability to act is very clear here. That is to say, the cost to you of not having a biological child is very low compared to the benefits that arise from it, which I'll talk about in the ability to improve the world. But second, the connection with the harm is pretty self-evident, which is to say that you have a choice to create a biological child, and so you have you have an obligation that's in connection to that decision that arises. Now, we get very tepid responses on morality from opposition. We get 2 things. We get first this idea that, well, we trade consent decisions all the time, so it doesn't actually matter that we're violating the consent of a child. And then the only example that they give of this is the representative agents that exist in government. I am perfectly comfortable saying that, yes, in a democracy, you consent through elections to have someone make decisions on your behalf. That's not a degradation of your agency, but rather a decision to delegate it to someone else. And secondarily, in the cases where you don't have a democracy, or you live under authoritarianism, I'm willing to say that, yes, that is immoral and people shouldn't live under those forms of government. But I think on a more structural level, besides the example, we don't have to show that all degradations of consent are unjustified, but we can at least say that this specific degradation of consent that is particularly violent, as Eva explains, is one that is so severe that it cannot be justified. I want to make this clear. I think the most superficial type of response you get to moral arguments are the exact ones you get out of the opposition, which is, well, you can't, defend the most extreme case possible of this moral principle, so it doesn't exist. But I think we're fine cabining it to this scenario of childbirth. Why is this consent decision so important? Because recognize that the refutation that they offer is this idea that, well, the child doesn't exist before they're born, so how can they be a moral agent, whatever. The response to this, though, is that at the moment that a child enters the world, I think they do become a moral agent who has a claim to being feeling violated and acted forcefully upon by having been brought into the world. It doesn't matter that they didn't exist before, but at the point that they do exist, they do have all the capacities that the opposition says that they don't. And at that point, you have committed an act of violence against them because this is your specific action that has brought them in here. The second thing, and the other response that they give is, well, a child is an extension of yourself as a parent, and so it's fine. I think this is a terrible principle, because if this were true, then every one of these 7 billion people on this planet would be two moral agents, and that is whoever our like last universal parent is, or our last universal parents are. Obviously, there's a distinction between the agency possessed by a child and the agency possessed by a person. And then they also talk about this idea that childbirth can be a moral necessity, for example, in aging populations. A few responses to this. First of all, it is unclear why your moral obligation ought to exist specifically with regard to economic growth for one country in comparison to all the bads we've talked about. Compare this to what Eva tells you, which is specifically that it is arbitrary to prefer your happiness, or in this case, the happiness of like your economic growth specifically, over that of other people. What then is the comparison? I think the comparison is that there are millions, tens of millions of people, children in this world who could be adopted, who currently live in things like starvation, in conditions like starvation and oppression and injustice, who you can help at low cost to yourself. And given that there is a trade-off between adoption and biological childbirth, because every parent faces resource constraints that limits the number of children they can have, you are foisting a harm upon these children who could be adopted by choosing to have biological children. I'll take the point. I'll take it from closing if closing has one.
At best, your argument about adoption is literally just such a caveated moral obligation that it cannot possibly function as a moral obligation. That is to say, you need to prove why this exists in general or to lots of people, rather than like the 10 million parents that might adopt, as opposed to the 3.5 billion parents that don't need to.
Yeah, so I think even if you can construct a world in which there are parents who are unable to adopt, I think there are two things to say here. I think first, your alternative option is to just not have children at all, and we're perfectly fine saying that in situations where you can't adopt, you ought to do that. And the second thing to note here is that even if you are one of the parents out there who couldn't adopt or who was so disadvantaged, I think it's still not excusable to impose upon the world the harms that we've explained to you. For example, the fact that the carbon emitted by your child over their hopefully 80, 90 years of life are going to have drastically bad effects on the planet as a whole, on people's ability, people who immediately exist, their ability to access the world. And this, I think, is at the crux of this, your ability to improve the world. I've explained a lot about the adoption suffering. The reason you weigh this a lot more than the nebulous things we hear about social justice out of the opposing side is twofold. First, because the suffering that exists right now from children who might be adopted is knowably severe. That is to say, we know exactly that people are hungry. This, by the way, in response to what the op says, is not something that you can just compare to context. I think a lot of the suffering in the world is pretty objective. And second of all, because it's more immediate. That is to say, it's unclear what the patterns of social justice will look like in the future, whereas right now, we know immediately that we can save people's lives and give them more happy lives by taking care of them before we start popping out kids. But the other thing to say here is that op says, well, it's fine because most people are happy about their lives, so actually you're improving the world. Well, three responses perhaps. The first is, I do think you should be risk averse, and this is responsive to the COPOI from Mish, which is to say that it is much worse to impose a harm upon the world or any other agent than it is to make any marginal improvement. That is specifically because at worst, when you choose to be risk averse, you leave the person as they are. However, when you impose a harm upon them, you make their condition a lot worse, whereas there are fewer opportunities to make yourself better thereafter than there are to make things worse. So given that people generally have fewer opportunities to improve their lives, you ought to err on the side of preventing harm from happening in the first place. People are becoming more depressed. Suffering in the world is on the rise. We propose.
Okay, I thank that speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible? So here goes my attempt of 7 minutes in disproving anti-natalism. So I'm going to take down opening government in 2 bits. Number 1 is the idea of connection to harm, which is a broad frame. Number 2 is consent constructed on. But firstly, just getting rid of the adoption bit. I think people do have an obligation towards kids who have not been adopted. It's called things like taxation, creating more social frameworks so that people who are within adoption agencies, orphanages, have a better life, like redistribute your wealth, etc., etc. I don't think it has to exist with like versus a biological child. It does not have to be a binary all the time. People have obligations towards poor people. People have obligations towards helpless orphans. That just exists in general in society, not connected to this debate. So firstly, with regards to connection to harm, what they base this on, and they never explicitly say this, by the way, I hope CG does, which is the harm argument is essentially boiled down to probability, which is that they assume that because there is even a 1% probability that you may end up living a bad life, therefore it's by default immoral, which is a bit strange if you think about it, because whether or not something is harmful and therefore it makes the decision immoral depends less on probability but more on certainty, which is to say you as an individual can never say for certainty that this individual's life won't be meaningful, won't be fulfilling, and won't have like net pleasure more than harm. Even if individuals live a sad life in general, sad life by the metrics of what we agree on in this room, they still end up saying in the deathbed that they have had a fulfilling life, and these are constructed realities that individuals have the agency to do themselves, as Sajid already quite clearly explained. Why is this so important in this particular instance? Is because we can also posit in a hypothetical scenario that there are so many individuals who are grateful to have been born. To say that any form of harm exists from individuals feeling harm in general is to say that for them to have constructed meaning out of their life is wrong, which means that parents not giving birth to them would be immoral, because clearly this was something that was a benefit, a moral good that you did not let happen because you did not give birth to someone. Obviously, that actually does not make sense. To the extent to which we don't we don't want to say that it's moral for people to always reproduce. However, it means that for a certainty, if you cannot conclude that people don't cause harm, like people's births won't be harmful, you can still go ahead and make that moral choice. But secondly, and more importantly, in a lot of cases with regards to consent as well, individuals who are contemplating moral choices, which is to say that if you are a moral individual and contemplating the choice of birth, you are probably a moral parent as well. Why is this so important in the context of this debate? If you are a moral parent, then you're probably going to allow your child to have a good life in general. And why is this so? It's because of the simple reason that if you look at children in general, so much of our realities and so much of our thoughts are constructed by the age of 18 that moral parenting can literally make or break the difference between you having a good life or a bad life. The point at which there is a human being who's able to contemplate the morality of anti-natalism, I think they're also able to contemplate the morality of good parenting versus bad parenting. Good parenting can literally make or break and have you not have traumas, etc., etc. Individuals end up having bad lives because of a lot of traumas that have happened during their childhood. We make sure that that does not happen. And when that does not happen, you're literally given good education, an ability to think for yourself what's good or bad, an ability to enjoy life, even if you don't achieve the best. So for example, parents not putting pressure on you to make it in life in the sort of society that they talk about, like competitive societies being bad and all of that. But secondly, with regards to consent, right? Thing is, consent is something that in this particular instance, I just already explained to you why consent is probably not important, but consent in this particular instance is a retrospective thing, which is to say that individuals who have been born at the age of 18 or 19 or even at the age of 40 can say that I probably did not want to be born. But a lot of individuals, a vast majority of individuals in the world end up saying that because the factors of the world is constructed in a way that they end up saying, I actually love the fact that I was born, and I end up being grateful for the fact that I was born. In those instances, individuals are capable of giving retrospective consent to this. Here's the thing, if individuals are capable of giving retrospective consent to this and therefore making their lives valuable, I'm not sure why their consent becomes so important at the conception of birth itself. Now, before I move on, CG, I think, yeah.
Do you think that it is moral to put individuals through insane amounts of pain in order for you to have children?
Oh, you mean labor? But I think like given that individuals can consent to that, and like a lot of women assign a lot of value to having children themselves, like a lot of women find it fulfilling to have children, sure, no problem. We're more than willing for them to go through that amount of pain. So 2 things in extension. Number 1 is, do we allow as humanity itself to allow for individual to construct happiness in their own way, which is say that this also sort of disproves the idea that in order for you to be happy, you have to displace someone else's happiness, and therefore that is immoral. Two reasons why this is true. We glorify things like relationships and love that are extremely deep to you, which is say the family, friends, etc., deep connections that you can form by yourself, especially if you have moral parents and so on and so forth, which enables you to construct meaning out of your life, regardless of whether or not you have high intelligence and so on and so forth. Secondly, we glorify things like having your own passion, creating your own meaning of life, etc., which again enables individuals to create meaning within their own existence. Before I move on, OGPY, yeah.
Your entire case is hinged on the idea that you can use individuals and children as an extension of the parent. Would it be right for me to enslave someone and consign them to a life of misery simply because I find it difficult to balance time for doing homework and doing laundry?
But if you as an individual are able to make sure that that individual does not have to go through all of that pain, through things like good parenting, etc., literally so much rests on the parents, and if parents can make this moral choice, then they can literally construct a meaningful life for their children. If that is true, then I'm not sure why that is particularly bad in this particular instance. But lastly, I think we are forgetting in a lot of instances that this debate can also exist out of our liberal bubble, which is to say that a lot of individuals, in the way in which they construct their meaning, is probably not through the lens of existence or David Benatar's anti-natalism, but rather to the simple joys of happiness in themselves that comes from their genetic extension. Yes, genetic extension may sound pretty bad to you because you think, oh, this is probably a form of, loving yourself, and that's particularly bad. But genetic extension is so very important to these people who have constructed their meaning out of living a conservative life that they did not themselves consent to, but rather were brought into this society, and society formed their morality in that particular way. If all of that is true, why is it immoral for these individuals to have children for the sake of their own fulfillment, or have children for the sake of the fact that they believe, like according to a religion, it's a pious thing to do to have children? If all of this is true, you're literally assigning a moral value to individuals, regardless of context or regardless of the circumstances that they were born in. I don't think they owe any moral obligation towards anti-natalism at all. Individuals should operate within the context in which they exist in. That same exists for Japan's aging population. The same exists for a conservative woman living in Pakistan whose only form of happiness is probably seeing their child smile. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, great. I thank that speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the member of government to open up the back half of this debate. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. You're used to, or should be used to, Cambridge running fun things in finals. So from closing government, we go far beyond consent and, oh, will your children be happy? We're going to talk about 3 fun things. First, human extinction. Second, pregnancy, and how this is an absolutely anti-feminist act, because contrary to opening opposition, women do not have a free choice ever in becoming pregnant. It is a patriarchy which has brainwashed them to believe they should become so. And Lucia will give moral legitimacy to that claim because I'm a man, but I'll make it anyway. And then third of all, we're going to talk about genetics, because no one has talked about the horrible things you pass in your blood to your children all the time. So first, point of extension and rebuttal is intertwined. So I think opening opposition say, they raise quite this large problem, this large question of saying, oh no, the world will run out of people. We won't have any immigrants, we won't have any people whatsoever. So first of all, I want to point out that often that won't be a problem because anyway, some people will have children. Like, it's not as if this is a policy motion, right? This is not a policy motion which says no one should have children ever. It's just questioning whether there is a moral duty. So even if we agree things are immoral, that having children, your own children is immoral, some people will still have those children, even if it's immoral, right? But I want to take them at their best, right? And this extension takes them at their best. And even if they are right, that the world will run out of people, or we should be considering the possibility of the world running out of people and humans becoming extinct, that's great. Here's why. Because even if opening opposition is right and the human race will go extinct, that will be an extraordinarily positive moral outcome, both in respect of the things the human race has done in the past, but also in respect of the actions that the human race has set in motion, which substantially denies the possibility of any sort of form of life in the future being a meaningful life. Why is that? Because recognize that in the past already, the human race has done incalculable damage. It has done incalculable damage to millions of other species, right? It has wiped out of the face of the earth millions of other species, sentient species, species which have cognitive ability, the ability to feel suffering, the ability to understand their own position and to think, right? It has not only done that, but also destroyed the environments, right? Both for other species, but also for humans. It has destroyed, from jungles to savannas and cemented them over, but also has set in motion irreversible cycles of climate change, which importantly, and this is key, also prohibit in the future the evolution of life as it has been evolving in the past. It is a life which is steeped into suffering, and not only the children's life as OG claims, but also all that of all other species, and prohibits life in the future as well. Not only that, obviously they have done huge eons of wars and atrocities, which have negatively impacted so many people, which will remember them far more, right? Because they're far more impactful on their lives than the small positive moments people have had. And they're also remembered because we were biologically wired to remember bad things far more because they serve as evolutionary cautions, right? All of that is to say, importantly at the end of this point, is that humans have done horrible things which they have to morally atone for, which they can only do by becoming extinct, but also, second of all, that they have prohibited in the future the evolution of life as it genuinely has, as it would have any meaning, such that extinction is appropriate in that scenario as a moral sort of recouping of that harm. Now, I also want to point out, says, but if that's your case, then we should all commit mass suicide. No, because mass suicide implies a massive amount of suffering, right, to be taken in right now by all of the population of humanity around the world, right? And that tips the moral scale to not being that good. Far better is a gradual extinction, right, which is far preferable because you're just avoiding the future harms without massively committing sort of harms for this generation. Now, that's the first point. And recognize, by the way, you all will also recognize that all of our extensions are independent from each other. So if you don't buy one, all of the others still stand. So second point, pregnancy. Recognize that, the process of having a biological child is an immoral one for women. And it is an essentially anti-feminist and immoral one. Why is that? First, because pregnancy is an extraordinarily difficult and grueling process, which takes so much out of your ability to live your life, right? It is extraordinarily painful as you go through it, from morning sickness to the huge ways it impacts your body, but also in terms of the ways it harms your mental health, and it causes so often depression, but also in terms of the ways it pains your body and destroys your body at the point of birth. Now, this is not consented into, and that is where the immorality kicks in. Why? Because there is always coercion when we talk about pregnancy. There is coercion on two levels. First, the couple coercion, right? Women almost never have children themselves, right, or on their own. It is overwhelmingly done within a couple decision where men pressure women into having children, or implicitly pressure them because, it's good for the family, we'll be so happy. What that means, right, is that overwhelmingly they don't make that decision consciously, and they can't even see the harms because they're blinded by this pressure. But second of all, more importantly, they're brainwashed by the patriarchy, right? The patriarchy has for centuries, if not millennia, right, told them that they have to have these children. It'll make them happy, right? When in reality, it will often not, but also they feel that they have to succumb to this biological need for the perpetuation of the species. And because of that brainwashing of the patriarchy, women don't get enough information whatsoever about how difficult pregnancy is going to be. Everyone tells them about the glow they'll feel, right, while they're pregnant and after they give child, right? Their literal brain, when they give birth, makes them, their brain makes them forget the pain of giving birth. Why? So they can have another kid later, right? Because never mind the pain you went through right then, you should have another one. All of this means that that process in and of itself, it's just critical for biological children, is immoral and is harmful for all of these women. You are putting all of these women through immense harm, which they cannot consent out of by sort of continuing to have children. That's moral. Third point I want to bring to you, genetics. Crucially, you're harming your child not only, as OG says, by bringing them into a world which may be good or bad for them, as O recognizes, but it is definitely bad that you are passing on your genetic heritage, which overwhelmingly tends to be negative. Genetic heritage is only positive in very rare individuals who are super healthy and brilliantly. There are 0.00% of the population. Overwhelmingly, we have bad genes. We have genes which contain the diseases of our parents, of our grandparents, the cancers, the depressions, the early onset Alzheimer's, the mental health conditions, which we then pass on to our children and inflict their lives horribly throughout, right? But also, I don't want to get too technical, but our telomeres already have been destroyed by the amount of pollution in the air we breathe, by the amount of GMO food we continuously eat, such that our children will definitely develop far more cancers than we will, right? Because of all these reasons, even on that reason alone, right, it is immoral to have a child because you're innately harming their life in the future. All these free extensions are independent. Each one of them individually wins you the debate.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the member of opposition here.
Can everyone hear me? Great. When I first saw this motion, my first thought was, I wish I'd picked open in government, because I pity the world in which has Matt Hazel procreate. But we're happy to leave this argument to Lucia's whip if she wants to take it. For now, I want to talk about two more important obligations. First, I want to talk about religion, why it is for some people the highest moral obligation, and why you can never make a moral obligation that conflicts with the duties of religion. Then I want to engage in the ludicrous utility monster debate the rest of the debate has had, and talk about why the only mechanism to solve future crises, including the telomere dissolution that Tudor posits about, which none of us clearly know about, why only that can be solved by future intellectual capital. First, quick extension with closing government. The first thing they point out about animal rights destroying the environment does not justify this obligation. That is to say, the past harm that you posit does not justify this motion, especially if we prove the only way to rectify future harm, i.e. if closing government says climate change is irreversible, then it doesn't matter what we do. The only thing we can literally do is produce more intellectual innovation that combats that. The second claim they make on pregnancy is strange. Two things to say on this, because one, as a woman, you only have agency in the present, you only have agency in the specific present moment that you're dealing with. It doesn't matter where your preferences stem from. What matters is that you have those preferences, that you have the duty to act on them. I posit that it is equally constraining on their side to say, well, the patriarchy brainwashed you over hundreds of years, so you should just never have children. It is literally much more freedom constraining to not even give the option of women to exercise their preferences in the first place. The last thing to say is on genetics. Yeah, maybe Matt's kids pass on his bad teeth, fine, we're willing to cop that L, but the point is, surely we can fix these things because more individuals and more generations are literally better adept at fixing the problems of the past. CF, the fact that life expectancy has gone up because of medical innovation, just because our telomeres are dissipating a little more rapidly, means literally nothing. First, I want to talk about religion. For many people, there are overwhelmingly overriding moral imperatives. If you're curious, by the way, it's 84% of the population. So, even if closing government wins their case, still not enough to beat all of the religious people having this obligation. Namely, for the vast majority of the people in the world, it is religious obligation. Why is this the case? Why is it the obligation to have kids for them? One, life is not arbitrary, but humans do have agency. Importantly, they have the obligation to multiply the fruits endowed to them by their God by continuing the world into the future. Two, especially for more monotheistic religions, you have the obligation to prepare the world for the Messiah, which means to rear the next generation more morally and in the charge of God. To literally believe in monotheism is to believe that God emerges from the gift of life and that it is your obligation to continue that gift, raise that gift, and in your family in God's image. The family unit, as a result, is quite literally the most sacred thing in religion. And that sanctity emerges from the obligation to protect life, and more importantly, it is that your life precedes the afterlife. What does this mean? Life is a prerequisite for the afterlife. And if you're curious about the utility effect on this, this is quite literally a world of unbounded utility, if you want to go by the OG terms. But more importantly, it is a It is a premise that you literally cannot access without the trial of life, because religion sees life as a trial to judge who is worthy and who is not worthy. What is then the problem? Because the real act of violence in this debate, for people who believe this, for people who prioritize religion as a moral obligation, is forswearing procreation and constraining utility in the hereafter. That is to say, constraining them to moral neutrality and never bringing a soul into being prevents the potentiality. Now, like, you might be asking, like, why do we care about religion? Does this mean we ought to have infinite children? No. What it means is that you ought be divinely obliged to be devout, know your capacities, and to help those who are disadvantaged. So, like, you should help foster kids. Like, you have a moral obligation to help foster kids. That does not mean that you have a moral obligation not to have kids. What it means instead is this. It is impossible to say that not having kids is a moral obligation. Why? Like, I don't need to believe this. You don't need to believe it. 16% of the world doesn't need to believe it. But if it constrains or contradicts any individual's moral imperative, it can never constitute a moral obligation. That is to say, if Mish has a type of moral code or has moral obligations and imperatives that he believes to be important, then me constraining him by saying, no, there is this moral obligation that you have to abide by cannot be a moral obligation. And perhaps you're thinking, why should we care about religion? Because I think, one, I'll make the very simple basic argument that unless you have epistemic access into the nature of the afterlife, it is quite literally impossible to make the utility monster argument that GovBench makes, because you have no knowledge of whether or not God exists. There is an infinite expectation of utility in the afterlife and of God's mercy, acceptance, whatever. But more importantly, I think this is literally utility maximizing for religious people. That is to say, religious people don't derive like simple utility off of knowing that Japan's economic growth is 3% as opposed to 1%. They derive utility off of thinking that they are meeting the tenets of God and meeting the religious tenets, which is why OO's literal 3-second line about pious life was so important, and the fact that they didn't engage with it is damning. The last thing that I want to say is this. There is nothing inherently harmful about this religious action. There is a potentiality of harm. There is a potentiality of benefit. Thus far, opening government has only said there will be some harm. Closing government says here are some other harms. But they have not proved to you why there's a guarantee of harm. And this is important because especially when it comes to religious freedom and religious beliefs, the only times that we are willing to constrain individuals' beliefs is when we have a plausible reason to believe that it grossly impedes on another's rights. That is to say, especially because we think these things are such valuable and important moral obligations. I'll take OG.
The problem with your analysis is that it takes religion as exogenous rather than endogenous. That is to say, you should choose a different set of religious beliefs that is your moral obligation if that religion coerces you into doing this thing that is nobly bad for a lot of people.
No, it doesn't matter. All preferences are endogenous. That is to say, it literally does not matter where your preferences come from because there are so many things that shift your preferences in literally any iteration of the world. The point is that no matter what you do, no matter what moral obligations you have, they are always constructed by someone else or imposed on you by someone else. Therefore, it is impossible to say, well, that moral obligation is simply literally invalid. Quickly, I want to chat about fixing global crises. It is not evident in the problem of OO why the existing problems of the world are solved. Like maybe they solved Japan, they solved literally nothing else. 3 quick reasons why young people are better equipped to deal with the problems of the world and handle them. 1, they are more forward-facing. They care more about realizing their potential over preserving their place in the status quo, so they have an incentive to be better, they have an incentive to innovate. People that care about the coal industry and don't care about the environment are not young, they are the old ones, the landed gentry that have their positions already set up. The second thing is that these kids produce more intellectual capital to solve. It is quite literally more brains working on the problems that CG posits. The last thing is that they are more malleable. They learn the world as it is, not as it was. You learn the math that you were taught now. You learn the problems of the world now rather than the problems of the world in the 1960s, all of which poise you better to help the world. Very, very proud to oppose.
Okay, excellent. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the government whip speaker. Here.
Cool, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Sorry, just setting up my papers. By Theo's logic, if religion says that the way to heaven is to stone homosexuals, to kill people that want a divorce, and that women who have abortion should be outshone by society, then that's moral. I think that's nonsense. Religion is not universal, and in fact, religions massively contradict each other and frequently tell you to do quite immoral things. We posit that instead, that's probably quite immoral, and just because religion tells you that it's moral doesn't mean that necessarily it is. I think that they're very clearly out of this debate. I think that at the end of the day, they needed to justify where religions are moral and are right. I don't think they did that. They just said, oh, but some people believe it. I mean, some people may think that having sex with 13-year-olds is moral. That doesn't mean that it is. It indeed isn't. Three things I'm going to be talking about for the other relevant themes in the round. One, human existence. Second, children's lives. And lastly, about women. I think that the responses that we got to their sophisticated and distinct extension were basically, or rather very lackluster, because they were there. All right, first, on human existence. Look, I think that overall, the problem in the top half debate in many ways is that overall, it's just very dependent on whether or not your kid is going to have a morally righteous life and whether or not they're going to have a good life. I think Tudor sidesteps it by saying that any additional human being that you put on the planet is a harm, because human beings, let's face it, are incredibly immoral. I didn't know this, but you know, dolphins have a language. It is terrible that we are murdering them. Every species that we remove off of the face of the planet by our sheer existence is, you know, a species that has disappeared, a life that we have evaporated. I think OO needed to justify why it's good that the human population keeps perpetuating its existence when it comes at the cost of literally thousands of species. There's so many species that have gone extinct already. We eat animals all the time when we are alive, and we remove plants that have existed and are incredibly delicate and have incredibly developed systems. I think that that's something that's bad, right? Insofar as a plant scientist, I can tell you that plants actually do feel pain. And I have read a lot of papers that show that animals are able to distinguish themselves in a mirror. I think that at the end of the day, it is not just human suffering that you are extending, but it is also suffering of literally every species that we share this planet with. I think that that overall means that probably the most moral thing is for a species that has done nothing but take advantage of the resources that the planet has given them, that has done nothing except take away resources from other living human beings, that has consistently shown an inability to remain within the limits of what the natural world offers them, and instead only takes and takes and takes to disappear off the face of the planet. When we kind of POI this to OO, the response I think was very lackluster. It was like, that's an argument for mass genocide. No, it is not, because as Tudor points out, it is different to murder a bunch of people than to just simply do nothing to continue a species that is essentially colonizing the entire planet to gradually disappear. I think that that is the best way for things to continue existing, and the only way to guarantee that there won't be any other things like depression, but also other things like humans destroying environments and probably continuing that colonization onto Mars if Elon Musk is anything to go by. I think that at the end of the day, this is the argument that is most powerful in the debate, because it sidesteps the, will they, won't they, will the child be happy, etc. It doesn't matter. It will knowingly cause suffering and destruction, not to other human beings, but to planets in its entirety. Second argument that I want to talk about, and this is second thing that I want to talk about, and this is about children. I want to make again the observation that both teams on top half have the same problem. And I think that overall, they just fall prey to the issue of, on opening government, will they have a negative footprint? Potentially the kid will be really happy, maybe even incredibly happy. On OO, maybe they won't be happy. Maybe they'll actually be sad. It's basically completely dependent on whether or not the child lives. I think that the thing that Tudor offers you in his third extension is actually universal, because irrespective of if you're a good parent, irrespective of if you have the resources to make sure that that kid is vegan and is sustainable and doesn't have clothes from sweatshops, irrespective of that, you're still knowingly passing them your genes. And I think that that's problematic insofar as I don't think there is a single human being on the planet that doesn't carry things like genetic diseases, like alcoholism in their veins, like mental health problems that are like cancer and degenerative diseases that are passed on across generations. And the important difference here is that you know that those diseases are in your bloodline and you're still knowingly passing them on to another human being. I think that is important, because you can have some control over how you raise your child, and you can try and guarantee that that child is raised well, but you're still deliberately creating a human being that is going to have a lot of problems in the future. I want to deal within this. So I think that overall, that's the main thing that is like universal and knowing. The other thing that I want to deal with is OO's exchange case. they have two things that I want to respond to. Firstly, is the idea that, children are just an extension of yourselves. The main response that I have is that's not true, because children have independent thoughts from their parents, but also because they're suffering and the pain that they feel is not also felt by the parents. That means that you don't have a right to torture your child. And that's also why, for example, we say that children and not parents should decide who the child marries, what they go to school, whether or not they want to, do different things with their lives. They are independent. We don't think that you can just choose them to whatever. The last one, and this is a real killer, existence is utility negative. That means that in your world, you think women should be permanently pregnant because it is immoral for them to not be continuously procreating, because every second that they're not, they are, damaging the fabric of morality. I think that that is nonsense. At the end of the day, I think Tudor wins this clash. I will take opening up now.
Moral principles apply universally, which means you have to defend your principle in all cases. Why does an oppressed Hindu vegan minority in India who has never harmed the environment not deserve this reciprocity if it's a form of self-defense?
Because they do harm the environment, Sajid. I think it is literally impossible for any human being to not exist and harm the environment. And because we're insanely overpopulated, literally every new human being that you are is creating a huge environmental footprint. We should just go extinct. There's like a cool website you can go to, I think. Okay, last thing that I want to talk about, and that is about women. Labor is so incredibly painful that women have to forget about it. Like your brain chemistry removes the memory from your mind to convince you to be pregnant again. You can be in pain for 15 hours straight with back-breaking pain. Pregnancy itself is fucking horrible, right? Your organs get pushed up, your ankles swell because they can no longer support your body weight. You throw up your food. And I think there's so many, labor is the main cause of female mortality in so many nations. I think that means that you are knowingly putting individuals that already exist in harm's way for the sake of having a fulfilling life and being happy. We POI this to OA, and their response is like, but women consent. I think Tudor sidesteps it because he explains to you how biological urges often drive you to this, and biological urges aren't always moral. You may have a biological urge to kill other human beings because that means that you have more resources to yourself and you can survive better. That doesn't make it moral. But second is because the patriarchy itself tells you that it's moral. The response that opening opposition gives you is like, but those are the preferences of women. That's an excuse. It is shitty for men to justify the oppression of women by saying, but they chose to be housewives. They didn't want to go to university. Yes, but we made them not want that. So maybe it's not immoral for women to want children, but it's definitely immoral for men and for the patriarchy to convince them to go through immense amounts of pain for the sake of that child. I think that at the end of the day, it is immoral to put women through immense suffering. It is immoral for humans to destroy the environment, and it is immoral to pass bad things onto your kids. Vote CG.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now welcome up the opposition whip to close out this round of debate. Hear.
Panel, if Lucia were listening to our speech, she would have heard this line verbatim. There is nothing inherently harmful about this religious action. We're not advocating for stoning gays. We're not murdering Syrians on the basis of malicious takfir. What is sure is that there is certainly not a direct harm born to an already living individual, which are the circumstances under which we are willing to infringe how people construct their preferences and actualize them in the world with other people socializing. But particularly on our logic, where you have things like resource scarcity for more people being inevitable unless you innovate, unless you generate human potentiality, unless you allow yourself for that potentiality to manifest in an indefinite future, you do consign living beings now to what is the pain that the entirety of GovBench wants to keep them in, apparently. That is the part of our extension which was not responded to a line and in and of itself can win us this debate. because you are generating an upside potential to what the entirety of government characterized as a bad existence now, which people are still living for many years to come. Secondly, it is not immoral to not pop out children. Again, Lucia, if you deigned listen to a part of the speech, your imperative is one framed towards life as a religious individual. It's bounded by your capacity and religious will, which are also divine. So it's not immoral to not pump out children, but it is sacrilegious to condemn people for exercising their capacity to forward life. That includes to condemn people for adopting foster children. That includes to condemn people for not deciding to help others, which would help children and future lives. I am sick of debates quite literally refusing to grapple with the reality that 84% of the world does believe in religion just because so many of you do not. Secondly, closing government, I'm going to deal with this case by case and systematically decimate everyone else in this debate. One, human extinction. The human race has done incalculable damage in the past and destroyed environments. Extinction is morally neutral at best, and under our religious framework, wrong. This is not atonement. This is stasis. It's complicity because there is unknown upside potential that extends into the future, and you're deciding not to extend that potentiality because you've already borne a harm. This is a continuous harm. You continue to threaten those lives. And we're willing to admit of that. Second of all, they say climate change is irreversible, as are other harms. It prevents the actualization of other lives. One, you cannot forswear all people living without knowing epistemically whether or not there is some sort of solution in the past, because that is tantamount to murder when there are outside options, when the harm is infinite from not creating a next generation. For the same reason you care about not everyone committing suicide, government, you should also care about not everyone dying in an environmental cataclysm. Second of all, the answer to both is that you have the afterlife. So even if your existence in the world, as ever literally plagiarized like every other debater, Thomas Hobbes, that it's a brutal, nasty, and short, we have the answer of the afterlife because that is unbounded upward potential for 84% of the world. On animal life, which Lucia obviously wanted to flagellate her own concentration, what she does in her own life. It is immoral to not help animals. That is to say that animals do also suffer. You are correct. So if there is no potentiality, if there is potentiality to help those animals into the future, because they are also going to encounter an environmental crisis, you ought to make the most of that potentiality. On pregnancy, this principle extends to saying if a woman has socialized preferences, their preferences are illegitimate. Most preferences are a posteriori and by experience. If their preferences are always illegitimate, then you're constraining them more. They only have agency in the present moment. So you're consigning them to the patriarchy by saying your future decisions are somehow morally tainted by what the patriarchy did to you without you even coming into existence. How ridiculous is that? The question you have to ask yourself on this moral principle is, in a vacuum, would a woman of their own agency legitimately believe that the trade-off to rear a meaningful life and realize their religion is a good one? If that one person does so, the point fails because under their side, they're condemning them to immorality, which is bad action. Third of all, on genetics, you can rectify that by having more potentiality, more brains. Second of all, a lot of genetics are great and overwhelmingly great. They create life. On opening government, consent is decimated by our argumentation. The most divine utility is in the afterlife. You are holding off a potential being and condemning someone for allowing them to realize the fruits of the afterlife, which are unbounded and infinite. This is why we win on a utilitarian metric, because the unbounded capacity of an afterlife multiplied by your non-zero probability of a divine God in and of itself beats any calculation they could make, particularly when they don't have epistemic access into the future. Even if you're risk averse, that does not mean you foreclose all risk. This is necessarily true because a chain of causality is so complicated that you can never fully grapple with and forecast the risks that are borne by an action in the present into the future. It's too interconnected, and therefore you cannot let that principle stand because it literally forecloses any action whatsoever. Ava, I'll take you.
Our own preferences are knowable, but the preferences of another are unknowable. Given that even a small minority of people wish they had not been born and nobody is in the epistemic position to evaluate the moral worth of their birth, we should not place parental or potentially incorrect religious preferences over other preferences, especially when David tells you the harm you may impose is impossible for others to recover from.
A few things to that. One, those preferences of consent. So this is a really simple point. Consent only comes into being because you're a human life. So life precedes consent because without the life, you have nothing to consent to in the first place. So they've missed the chain of causality here. But second of all, you always have the potential to improve a life, which means that even if they didn't consent to their initial birth, they consent to all the future benefits that come from that. And once they've brought into existence, that potential is infinite, again, because of the afterlife, but also the capacity to improve their life in the status quo. Even at their best, they only prove that life is bad now. What we prove is that life will be better because the next generation is the only route for improvement. So again, inaction condemns those living to a living hellhole. That wins us the debate in and of itself. An unresponded part of Aditya's preference, even if you don't care about any of the religious material that we give you in this debate. Opening opposition, make 3 claims. 1, aging populations. Really not important given that Japan is not literally running out of food. This applies to so few people, does not matter in the context of this debate, which is broad. Second of all, social justice. Only if you have kids can minorities succeed. This is probably better by better than white people having more kids and swarming out your minorities. Third of all, life is good. We don't care. The afterlife is more important, as we told you in religion. Second of all, the pathway to happiness is thinking about fulfilling God's fruits if you're a religious person, 84% of the world. Third of all, you can beat the problems that make life miserable now by creating more brain power, creating more potentiality. Look, at the end of this debate, you have 2 prongs to give us this logic. 1, on a utilitarian logic, the afterlife is unbounded. It is a religious harm that doesn't conflict inherently with anyone else's rights, as is told by the ambiguity of this debate. That is enough to vote us in, but if not, believe Aditya's extension. So proud to oppose.
Okay, I think everyone